Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his death.
Prince Edward was never meant to be the royal anyone feared, yet inside the palace walls, something subtle, calculated, and impossible to ignore began to unfold. While Queen Camilla held the spotlight and Prince William embodied the future, Edward moved in the only way the monarchy truly respects, quietly. A missed signal here, a careful appearance there, and suddenly the forgotten prince didn't look forgotten anymore. But what if the quietest man made the boldest move? Grab a seat as we reveal why, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more. The royal nobody everyone misread. While Andrew burned through headlines with scandal after scandal, while Harry tore open the institution from across the Atlantic, and while Charles spent decades waiting, adjusting, and preparing for the crown, there was one royal who did something far less visible, far less celebrated, and yet far more enduring. He showed up, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. That man was Prince Edward. For most of his life, Edward was the royal the cameras rarely chased, the one the tabloids struggled to turn into a headline, the figure who seemed permanently placed just outside the center of every major story. No explosive interviews, no tell-all memoirs, no public feuds, just a steady calendar of engagements that rarely made front-page news but never stopped coming. Year after year, event after event, he built something that did not look like power, at least not in the way the public had been trained to recognize it. And that was exactly why he was misread. Funny, isn't it? One royal watcher reportedly remarked, the quieter he stayed, the easier it was to assume he didn't matter. Text wrapping break. But what if that assumption was the mistake? Inside the palace, consistency is not just routine, it is currency. The monarchy does not only survive on charisma or controversy. It survives on reliability, on figures who can be trusted to carry the institution forward when others become distractions. And while louder names dominated the narrative, Edward was quietly becoming that figure. The media, for years, treated him like background scenery, a supporting character in a much louder family drama. Coverage followed the noise, and Edward never gave them any. That absence of drama made him easy to overlook, easy to sideline, easy to underestimate. But in doing so, the narrative missed something critical. While others defined themselves through conflict, Edward defined himself through endurance. No headlines, no chaos, just work, one commentator noted. That doesn't sell papers, but it builds trust. And trust inside a monarchy that has been tested repeatedly is not a small thing. Behind palace doors, that trust translates into something far more tangible. When roles need filling, when pressure rises, when appearances must be maintained without risk, the same name keeps resurfacing, not loudly announced nor dramatically elevated, just quietly relied upon. So while the public saw a man fading into the background, the palace saw something else entirely. Someone dependable, someone steady, someone who could be placed anywhere without causing disruption, and more importantly, without drawing the wrong kind of attention. So as his role quietly shifts behind palace doors, how do Camilla's choices begin to change the narrative? Stay with us. Camilla's optics problem started before anyone admitted it. A brooch. Not large, not loud, but impossible to ignore once you understand what it means. Resting just above the heart, carefully chosen, deliberately placed, it carried more weight than any speech ever could. In royal life, nothing worn that close to the chest is accidental. When Queen Camilla stepped out wearing a piece shaped in the style of a historic crown, adorned with carefully set stones, royal watchers didn't see jewelry. They saw a message. Authority, continuity, and alignment with the crown itself, all communicated without a single word being spoken. It was elegant, controlled, and unmistakably intentional. People think it's just fashion, one observer noted quietly, but in that world, Its language. And that is where the optics began to shift. Because while Camilla's approach leaned into visible declarations, symbols that reinforced her position and presence, another approach was unfolding at the same time, one that didn't rely on display at all. Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, weren't responding with competing symbols, or louder gestures, or carefully curated visual statements. They were doing something far quieter, and in many ways, far more difficult to read. They were showing up where it mattered, and just as importantly, not showing up where it didn't. That difference is subtle, but inside palace dynamics, it changes everything. One approach says, "Look at where I stand." The other quietly asks, "Look at where I choose to stand." Royal watchers notice these shifts long before the public does. They track appearances, placements, absences, and patterns that don't make headlines immediately, but begin to form a narrative over time. Then, the tabloids catch on, translating those quiet signals into dramatic interpretations, turning a brooch into a power statement, an absence into a snub, a presence into alignment. And suddenly, what looked like isolated moments begins to feel like something coordinated. Inside the palace, the image is not a decoration. It is policy dressed in elegance. Every detail, from clothing to seating to timing, functions as a controlled form of communication, especially in a system where confrontation is avoided at all costs. No one raises their voice. No one makes public accusations. Yet messages are still sent, clearly and precisely, for those who know how to read them. But what if Prince Edward's real move was not what he said, but where he kept standing? Keep watching to find out. The move wasn't loud, it was positional. In royal life, position is never random. It is studied, rehearsed, and understood long before the cameras begin to roll. And once those cameras do roll, every inch of space becomes part of the message. Take Easter, not just any service, but one of the most closely watched appearances in recent memory. The return of Catherine, Princess of Wales, alongside Prince William and their children, shifted the entire atmosphere. The Wales family didn't need to say anything. Their presence said enough. Stability, continuity, and future. Now look closer at the frame. Edward wasn't drifting somewhere at the edge, nor was he anchored within Queen Camilla's immediate circle. He was positioned near the future, within the visual orbit of William's line, aligned with the next chapter rather than the current center of gravity. It was subtle, almost easy to miss if you were not looking for it, but once seen, it became difficult to ignore. Funny how a few steps to the left can change the whole story, one analyst remarked. And then there were the absences. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, was expected, but not present. Officially, it was explained away simply, quietly, without drama. But in royal circles, absence carries weight. It raises questions, it creates space, it shifts attention. When someone consistently disciplined in duty is suddenly not there, it rarely feels accidental. Weeks earlier, at the Commonwealth Day service, the pattern had already begun to form. Appearances, then non-appearances, presence in one setting, absence in another. To the public, these might look like isolated scheduling decisions. To the media, they become stories. But to insiders, they read as something far more deliberate. Because placement is message. Where you stand signals alignment. Who you stand beside signals trust. And when you choose not to stand somewhere, that silence speaks just as clearly. The public sees the photograph. The media breaks down the photograph. But inside palace walls, the photograph is never just an image. It is a statement, constructed carefully, layer by layer, without ever needing to be explained. So when Edward appears near William's frame, when Sophie's absence removes her from another, and when Camilla's orbit begins to feel just slightly less central in those moments, it does not need to be announced as a shift. It simply begins to look like one. But as those subtle placements begin to signal a shift, what role is Sophie really stepping into next? Let's watch closely. Sophie was never just standing beside him. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, rarely enters a room trying to dominate it, and that is precisely why she is so often misread. The quietest partner in the room may have been the one quietly adjusting the board while everyone else was watching the pieces. For years, Sophie built a reputation that looked simple on the surface: composed, polite, consistently well-prepared, always aligned with duty, never reaching for attention. It was the kind of image that the public tends to categorize quickly: supportive spouse, reliable presence, background figure. But in a system like the monarchy, that kind of consistency is not passive, it is controlled. She doesn't chase the spotlight, one royal observer noted. She decides when it finds her. That distinction matters, because while Prince Edward represents steadiness in motion, Sophie represents precision in timing. Her appearances are not just scheduled, they are placed. Her absences are not just explained, they are felt. Look at the pattern closely. When she attends, everything aligns. The tone is calm, the optics are clean, the message is one of quiet competence. She does not disrupt the frame, she stabilizes it. And when she does not attend, the absence creates a gap that draws attention without ever demanding it. People assume it's a coincidence, a commentator said, but coincidence doesn't repeat this cleanly. That is where her role shifts from presence to strategy. In royal life, spouses are not decorative additions to the institution. They are part of its internal mechanics. They influence tone, shape perception, and in moments of tension, they help define whether a move feels aggressive or controlled. Sophie's greatest strength is not just that she supports Edward, it is that she calibrates how his actions are perceived. Because without her, Edward's positioning could easily be read differently. A man quietly aligning himself away from certain circles, appearing near others, and stepping into key roles at the right moments could be interpreted as calculated, even confrontational. But with Sophie beside him, or strategically not beside him, the same actions take on a different tone. They feel measured, considered, responsible. She softens the edge of every move, one insider observed, and that makes those moves harder to challenge. The public, however, often misses this entirely. Viewers are conditioned to respond to noise, to bold statements, to visible conflict. Sophie offers none of that. She operates in restraint, in timing, in consistency. That makes her less visible, but it also makes her more effective. By the time her role becomes obvious, the shift she helped shape is already in place. And then there is the coordination. Edward's positioning, Sophie's appearances, their shared absences, the way they seem to move in parallel without ever appearing rehearsed. It creates the impression of instinct. But inside a system that values control above all else, instinct rarely works alone. What looks like quiet loyalty from the outside begins to resemble something far more deliberate when viewed from within. Not a reaction, not a sudden adjustment, but a sustained, carefully managed approach to where they place themselves, how they are seen, and when they choose to step forward or step back. But if that coordination was deliberate, what changed to force Edward into a new role? Watch closely. Andrew's collapse quietly rewrote Edward's role. The disruption didn't begin with Prince Edward. It began when Prince Andrew's personal crisis spilled beyond his own orbit and into the structure of the entire family. What had once been contained as a scandal became something heavier, something that began to rearrange logistics, optics, and even tradition. Edward's family plans were among the first to feel it. Wood Farm, a quiet residence on the Sandringham estate, had long served as a place of retreat, a location tied to family routine rather than public scrutiny. That space suddenly became occupied under very different circumstances. Andrew's relocation, following his removal from a more prominent royal footing, shifted the dynamic immediately. It wasn't just about where Andrew would live, it was about how that decision would ripple outward. Everything around him had to adjust, one observer noted, not just the man but the system. Edward and his family had intended to use that same space over Easter. Those plans disappeared almost instantly, not through confrontation, not through public complaint, but through quiet necessity. What had once been a private family arrangement was overtaken by a broader institutional problem. And that is where Edward's role began to change. The media focused, as it always does, on Andrew himself. The headlines stayed locked on scandal, speculation, and fallout, turning every development into another chapter of controversy. That was the visible story. But beneath it, another narrative was unfolding, one that rarely made headlines. Someone had to manage the consequences. Edward did not step forward with statements. He did not position himself in front of cameras. He did not attempt to reframe the situation publicly. Instead, he moved in the only way that mattered inside palace walls, quietly, directly, without spectacle. Reports suggested that he was among the few who chose to visit Andrew during this period, not out of defense, not out of loyalty to the behavior that caused the crisis, but with a different purpose entirely. Resolution. Dragging this out helps no one, Edward was said to have implied through his actions, not his words. Not you, and certainly not the institution. It is a subtle distinction, but an important one. Because in a monarchy built on continuity, disruption is not just a personal issue. It becomes an institutional risk. And the people who are trusted most are not the ones who avoid that risk, but the ones who step into it and contain it. Edward's approach did not generate headlines because it was never designed to. There were no leaks, no sympathetic narratives planted in the press, no attempt to reshape public perception in his favor. Instead, he absorbed the situation internally, helping to move it toward resolution rather than prolonging it. Anyone can comment from the outside, one palace insider remarked. Not everyone can fix things from within. That difference is where value is measured. In public, Andrew remained the story. In private, the story was shifting toward who could stabilize the aftermath. And in those moments, far from the cameras, Edward's steady presence began to take on a different meaning. Not just the reliable brother, not just the quiet figure in the background. So, as Edward's role quietly expands, what did he not receive that changed everything? Let's pay attention to what comes next. The snub that may have changed the game. Sometimes in royal life, what you do not receive tells a bigger story than what you do. There was no public confrontation, no visible frustration, no carefully worded response issued through aides. Just a list. An official recognition moment, polished and ceremonial, where names were called, roles were acknowledged, and contributions were formally elevated. And within that moment, something quiet but significant happened. Two names were missing. Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had, by that point, already begun absorbing more responsibility than many expected. As King Charles III stepped back from certain duties due to health concerns, the burden did not vanish. It shifted. Engagements still needed to be attended, diplomatic roles still needed representation, and the public face of the monarchy still needed to appear stable. Edward and Sophie stepped forward. Not dramatically, not with declarations of duty, but through action. Solo overseas visits, increased appearances, a willingness to fill the quiet gaps that appear when the institution is under strain. They became in many ways the monarchy's dependable reserve, the figures who could be deployed without risk. They did more, one observer remarked, and somehow they were seen less. Because when the honors were announced, attention landed firmly on Queen Camilla, on Prince William, and on Catherine, Princess of Wales. The narrative reinforced what the public already understood. The present queen, the future king, the future queen. It was clean, it was expected, it was politically sound. But it also left a gap, and that gap did not go unnoticed. Wait a minute, one commentator questioned. Who's actually been doing the work behind the scenes? The public, perhaps more than the palace anticipates, has a soft spot for quiet consistency. There is something deeply compelling about the figure who keeps showing up without recognition, who continues to deliver without reward, who absorbs responsibility without demanding credit. That narrative writes itself, and once it begins to take shape, it becomes difficult to contain. The media picked up on it slowly at first, not as a headline, but as a question. Why were the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh absent from that moment? Was it oversight? Was it strategy? Was it simply the reality of hierarchy, or something more nuanced? Inside the palace, the answer may not have been as dramatic as speculation suggested. Honors lists are shaped by many factors, from protocol to politics to long-term messaging. But perception does not wait for clarification. It builds its own interpretation. And perception in a monarchy is not a side issue, it is central. Because whether intentional or not, the omission created a narrative that lingered, that the wrong people were being overlooked, that those carrying quiet weight were not being matched with visible acknowledgement, that the balance between contribution and recognition had begun to feel uneven. Edward characteristically said nothing. No visible reaction, no shift in tone, no attempt to leverage the moment publicly. If anything, he continued exactly as before, attending, representing, maintaining the same steady pace that had defined him for decades. But silence does not mean absence of awareness. People assume quiet means passive, one insider noted. It doesn't. It often means patient. And patience, when combined with consistency, becomes something else entirely over time. Because moments like this do not just pass. They accumulate. They shape how figures are perceived, how alliances are read, how the public begins to differentiate between those who are celebrated and those who are relied upon. The snub, whether deliberate or circumstantial, did not create Edward's trajectory, but it sharpened it. It clarified something that had been forming quietly in the background, giving it definition without ever forcing him to say a word. And as that silence continues to build, what do the numbers begin to reveal about Edward's position? Keep watching to find out. The numbers that quietly shifted the balance. The shift didn't begin with a speech or a scandal. It began with numbers. Not the kind announced in grand halls, but the kind released quietly, studied closely, and then debated everywhere from newsroom panels to late-night conversations. Approval ratings, favorability scores, public sentiment. In a monarchy, these are not just statistics, they are signals. And for Queen Camilla, those signals were becoming harder to ignore. At one point, her journey had been framed as a long, difficult climb toward acceptance. A woman who endured years of scrutiny before finally stepping into her role. For a while, that narrative held. It worked. The public softened. The institution stabilized around it. But now, something felt different. Why does it suddenly feel like the ground isn't as steady as it was? One commentator asked during a televised debate. Because while her position remained intact, the public mood around it was shifting. Approval numbers dipped. Unfavorable opinions edged upward. Not dramatically enough to cause alarm inside palace walls, but steadily enough to create discomfort outside them. And once that discomfort reaches the public, it rarely stays contained. Meanwhile, comparisons began to emerge. Not officially, not endorsed, but quietly circulated. Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, long viewed as background figures, were now appearing in a very different light. Their numbers were stable. Their public perception remained largely positive. No scandals, no sharp controversies, just a steady line of trust that had been building for years without much attention. And that contrast created a new kind of conversation. Wait, how did they become more trusted without anyone noticing? A columnist wrote. But the story didn't stop there, because the public wasn't just comparing individuals. It was beginning to read the monarchy as a whole, looking at how each figure fit into the larger picture. And in that picture, another name kept pulling focus: Prince William, the future. Every number, every headline, every appearance was now being measured against what came next. And within that context, the question was no longer just about popularity. It became about alignment. Who feels like they belong in that future? For Camilla, that question carried weight. Not because her role was under threat in any immediate sense, but because perception was beginning to place her differently within the timeline of the monarchy. Less forward-facing, more anchored in the present moment than in what was coming next. The media picked up on it quickly. Headlines didn't accuse, but they hinted. Segments didn't declare, but they compared. A photograph here, a statistic there, a pattern forming without ever being officially acknowledged. And as those patterns repeated, the narrative sharpened. The public leaned in. Supporters defended Camilla, pointing to her years of service and the difficulty of her path. Critics questioned whether the monarchy was quietly shifting its center of gravity. Others simply watched, trying to understand what these subtle changes actually meant. And through all of this, the palace said very little. No direct responses, no urgent corrections, just the usual steady tone, maintaining continuity, avoiding escalation. But silence, in moments like this, does not quiet the conversation. It deepens it. Because when the public is left to interpret the numbers on its own, those numbers begin to tell a story. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. A story where Camilla remains central, yet increasingly scrutinized. A story where William represents what is coming, whether anyone says it out loud or not. And a story where Edward and Sophie are no longer just background figures, but part of a broader shift that people are only beginning to notice. While those shifts take shape in silence, what does it reveal about Prince William's future? Don't look away. William's future is the real battlefield. Inside the monarchy, succession is never just a distant event. It is a constant presence, shaping behavior long before the moment arrives. Decisions are made with it in mind. Alignments begin to form around it. And those who understand this early do not wait for the transition. They prepare for it. That is where Prince Edward's strategy begins to look very different. Because this is not about Edward moving against Queen Camilla. It never really was. It is about Edward quietly moving toward something else entirely, toward the structure of a monarchy that will exist after King Charles III. He's not playing today's game, one royal commentator suggested. He's positioning himself for the next one. And that next one revolves around William. Look at the pattern of Edward's work over the past few years. It is not loud, not dramatic, and certainly not factional. There are no public alliances declared, no visible attempts to dominate attention. Instead, there is service. Consistent, visible, and increasingly international. Overseas tours, diplomatic representation, quietly stepping into roles that require credibility rather than charisma. These are not the moves of someone trying to win headlines. They are the moves of someone building trust within the institution itself. He shows up where it matters, an observer noted. And then he lets the work speak. That approach becomes even more significant when placed next to William's future role. A monarchy under William will demand stability, reliability, and figures who can operate without creating unnecessary friction. It will not reward noise. It will depend on discipline. And that is exactly where Edward fits. Alongside him, Princess Anne continues to represent that same serious duty orbit. Like Edward, she operates without spectacle, without distraction, and without deviation from responsibility. Together, they form a quiet but powerful contrast to the more volatile figures the monarchy has had to navigate in recent years. "Watch the ones who never need defending," a broadcaster remarked. "They're the ones the institution leans on." That alignment matters, because while Camilla remains firmly positioned within the present structure of the monarchy, Edward's trajectory feels increasingly tied to what comes next. Not through confrontation, not through displacement, but through readiness. This is where the public narrative begins to shift. The question is no longer as simple as, did Edward outsmart Camilla? That framing starts to feel too narrow, too focused on individual rivalry. Instead, a different question begins to emerge. Did Edward simply understand the transition earlier than everyone else? The media has started to circle this idea, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. Coverage no longer focuses only on isolated appearances or individual moments. It begins to connect them, to map a broader pattern of positioning, service, and alignment. And the audience begins to follow. Because when viewed through the lens of succession, everything looks different. Appearances are no longer just appearances. They are signals of where each figure stands in relation to the future. Actions are no longer isolated. They are part of a longer arc, leading toward a new reign. Inside the palace, this kind of positioning is rarely accidental. The smartest players do not wait for the crown to change hands before adjusting their place within the system. They move early, quietly, without drawing attention to the shift as it happens. Now, as those early moves take shape, what happens when the palace chooses silence? Stay tuned. The palace stayed silent, and that made everything louder. No denial, no dramatic statement, no carefully worded correction slipped to the press. And somehow, the story only got bigger. That is the paradox of the monarchy. When it speaks, it controls the narrative. But when it chooses not to speak, the narrative begins to grow on its own, shaped by speculation, amplified by media, and interpreted by a public that is always watching more closely than it appears. In this moment, the palace chose silence. No visible pushback against the shifting conversations. No attempt to clarify positioning, appearances, or the growing comparisons between Prince Edward and Queen Camilla. Just the steady, familiar tone of continuity, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. But that silence did not calm anything. It fed it. The less they say, the more people start connecting the dots themselves, one media commentator observed. And the media did exactly that. Tabloids moved quickly, filling in the gaps with interpretation. A photograph became a statement. An absence became a signal. A sequence of appearances became a narrative arc. Without an official voice to anchor the story, every outlet began shaping its own version of events, some cautious, others far more dramatic. The public followed closely. Fans, critics, and casual observers all began reading the same silence in different ways. For some, it suggested control, a deliberate refusal to dignify speculation. For others, it felt like confirmation, as if the lack of denial was itself an answer. Why wouldn't they shut it down if it wasn't true? One viewer questioned online. And that question alone was enough to keep the conversation alive. Within this environment, perception began to shift subtly but powerfully. Edward's silence looked like discipline. It matched his image, steady, controlled, uninterested in public confrontation. The absence of response reinforced what people already believed about him, that he operates quietly, that he avoids unnecessary noise, that he lets actions speak where words are withheld. Camilla's position, however, was read differently. Her silence, placed against the rising scrutiny of her role and the comparisons being drawn, began to feel less like control and more like exposure. Not because she responded incorrectly, but because she did not respond at all in a moment when attention was already intensifying around her. The same silence carried two different interpretations, and that is where the tension truly deepened. Inside the palace, this approach is not new. The monarchy has long understood that speaking less often preserves stability. It avoids escalation. It maintains a sense of distance from the noise. But in moments like this, when the public is already leaning in, that same restraint can reshape the entire mood. While silence reshapes perception, what quiet strategy has Edward already been building? Let's find out. The secret move was never one move. Here's the twist no one expected. The secret move wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, a hidden decree, or a carefully staged palace ambush. It was something far quieter and far more difficult to detect. A chain of decisions, each small on its own, but together, forming a shift that now feels impossible to ignore. That is how Prince Edward played it. Not loudly, not suddenly, but consistently. He stood where the future was forming, close to Prince William's orbit without ever announcing that alignment. He chose restraint over spectacle, allowing others to dominate headlines while he built credibility in quieter spaces. When crisis hit, particularly around Prince Andrew, he stepped in not to comment, but to resolve, absorbing pressure instead of amplifying it. Anyone can react, one observer noted. Not everyone can stabilize. That difference added up. At the same time, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, moved in parallel, her appearances and absences shaping perception without ever drawing direct attention. Together, they created a rhythm that felt natural on the surface but revealed coordination underneath. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just controlled. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla remained firmly positioned, but increasingly defined by the present rather than the future. Her role did not collapse, but the optics around it began to shift. Public sentiment became more divided, media narratives more questioning, and in that environment, even stability can start to feel like vulnerability. The palace, as always, chose silence. No corrections, no clarifications, just the steady continuation of duty. But that silence allowed the media to expand the story, to connect moments that may or may not have been intended to connect, to build a narrative of movement, alignment, and quiet repositioning. And the public leaned in, because once those pieces are placed side by side, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Edward near the future, Camilla anchored in the present, William at the center of what's coming next, Sophie shaping the edges, the palace saying nothing while the story grows louder outside its walls. The question then stops being about a single move. It becomes about understanding the game itself, because the crown rarely rewards noise for long. It rewards usefulness, reliability, the ability to operate without destabilizing the system that depends on you. And over time, those qualities accumulate into something far more powerful than a single decisive act. So what are we really looking at here? Did Edward quietly plan this, step by step, positioning himself ahead of a transition everyone else was reacting to too late? Or did he simply understand the rules better than everyone else, and play them exactly as they were always meant to be played? So, what do you think? Has Prince Edward quietly mastered power while being overlooked, positioning himself closer to the center than anyone realizes? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.